before we start, I'd just like to give some context because Jordan Peterson has been around for long enough so that we've observed almost the entire life cycle. He started, like any invertebrate, as an egg in the psychology faculty of the University of Toronto. You never know. Most eggs don't hatch, but with the crucial catalyst of the Canadian hate speech law around misgendering and expressions related to transgender people, he found his, that was the spark which allowed him to enter his the next phase, which I consider to be the larval form of Jordan Peterson, and that's what we're seeing now. And that's right. It's a very capable form. Sometimes larvae are the most ferocious. Compare the caterpillar with the butterfly, for instance. And here he was very much straddling the place of being that he began in academia, being a respectable professorial type, very erudite, with just the first glimmerings of his metamorphosis into a full-blown right-wing, two-face cosplaying Twitter influencer. And so this isn't late period Jordan Peterson. This was back when he was publishing books that became bestsellers, the beginning of his movement. He was still having respectful conversations with people who disagreed with him, and as well as engaging with student groups at universities, which at this point I question if he would feel comfortable, if there's any safe spaces on campus for him anymore. Mm-hmm. But we're not talking about two-tone suit, lobster socks Jordan Peterson. That had yet to be. This is still very much greatest public intellectual alive, philosopher of the masses, finder of lost young men, Jordan Peterson. And I think that's important to realize, because when you see him talking about climate, especially, it's this was when people were listening to him, and he kind of represented the best case, the strongest argument, the strongest take from the climate denial side.
Yeah, this is definitely pre-Daily Wire Jordan Peterson. I think everything you just said sounds right, except the one thing I want to push back on is that he's not cosplaying Two-Face. He's cosplaying the Riddler. But otherwise, I largely concur. That is good context. So let's see what he has to say.
Drought, flooding, and ocean acidification, unanticipated for 65 million years, all result from climate change, according to over 700 of your fellow scientists. So I was wondering whether you thought climate change could be an issue that could unite us all on left and right, moving us beyond debates about C16 to discussions at the UN at Katowice next month, where perhaps humanity might finally discover its global map of meaning.
No.
I do just want to pause to say that whatever you think about the opinions he's about to express, there's some poise there I like.
And that's actually the thing that I miss the most about the larval stage, as well as the more subdued coloration. He right now is too angry and weepy. He's lost some of that wit that helped him create all that owning the libs viral content. Instead, right now he's just screaming at a screen in Ben Shapiro's basement.
I mean, there's a couple of reasons. I mean, the first reason is that I spent a lot of time reading. I worked for a UN committee for 2 years on sustainable economic and ecological development, and read a very large amount during that period of time and learned a lot, much of which made me much more optimistic than I had been before I read the relevant literature, which was a real shock to me. But the climate change issue is an absolutely catastrophic, nightmarish mess, and the idea that that will unite us is that's not going to unite us. I mean, first of all, it's very difficult to separate the science from the politics. And second, even if the claims, the more radical claims are true, we have no idea what to do about it. And so, no. And besides, it's even worse than that. Here's one of the worst things about the whole mess is, so as you project outwards with regards to your climate change projections, which are quite unreliable to begin with, and the unreliability of the measurement magnifies as you move forward in time, obviously, because the errors accumulate. And so if you go out 50 years, the error bars around the projections are already so wide that we won't be able to measure the positive or negative effects of anything we do right now. So how in the world are you going to solve a problem when you can't even measure the consequence of your actions? Like, how is that even possible? And besides that, well, what's the solution? What are we going to do? Switch to wind and solar? Well, good luck with that. Just try it and see what happens. We can't store the power. Germany tried it. They produced more carbon dioxide than they did when they started because they had to turn on their coal-fired plants again. That wasn't a very good plan. Well, we don't want nuclear. It's like, okay, what happens at night? The sun goes down. Well, isn't that something we should have taken into account? Oh, we got to flip on the coal-fired plants. Well, so it was a complete catastrophe, and all that happened was the price of electricity shot up. It was like zero utility. So that's not a solution. So what are we going to do about it? Well, we should cut back. We can't consume as much as
this. The reason that I flagged this clip is because it typifies one of the most egregious forms of intellectual malpractice that you see Jordan Peterson engage in all the time. It's not obvious unless you're paid attention to him for a long while, or he happens to be trespassing into your intellectual territory. But I believe, as part of my own ethic of being an intellectual and an educator, that if people are granting you the authority to offer your opinion, they're listening, they're taking your words seriously, they're approaching you as a source of insight, then you're under a strong obligation. The thing that makes you a true intellectual and not a sophist, the fundamental ethic of your calling, requires you to identify when you know what you're talking about, when it's something that you've researched and that you can speak with a profound knowledge and expertise about a particular topic. In those areas where you know what you saw in the news. There's, of course, a middle zone of kind of educated lay opinion, and that's fine too, as long as you flag it. But a professor is supposed to have a profound expertise in a particular subject, and that the authority and the deference that's granted to such a figure really should be bounded by that area. If you are a plant biologist or an immunologist, then you might have a really fascinating take about solar power or gender binaries or international affairs, but you shouldn't expect your audience to just defer to you intellectually on those matters as a recognized authority, right? You need to prove that you you actually have something to say in this area outside your field.
Yeah, and it is really worth noting here that the way that he's presenting this is not like he's taking us through, like, I mean, to a certain extent he is, but to a great extent, like he's not really like, okay, well, here's how this seems to be true here, and so this is why I think that, right? Like, again, there's some arguments, but mostly what he's doing here is being presented in this way that's kind of like, he's thought about this so much it makes him tired, and he's just sort of, he's down from the mountaintop and he's sharing his conclusions with you much more than
Exactly.
thinking.
He's such a luminary that the UN went to him to study climate change, and he spent years apparently not in seclusion, because this was also when he had his highest intellectual profile, highest public profile, and was doing events and writing books. But he gives the impression of this, he claims this high level of expertise that he spent years reading.
Right.
And one, that's not the same as being a climate scientist. In fact, he doesn't cite any climate scientists, just a bunch of economists, and economists that are generally on the climate skeptical side of the political divide. So he has no personal background in doing this work, in creating this knowledge, engaging with it. And yet he comes down like a pope to speak ex cathedra and deliver the correct line to these students that treat him as a rock star professor. They're not, it's not a panel of climate scientists. It's not a panel of environmental economists. It's people who are looking to him for guidance. And I think his take is wrong on climate.
Yeah.
However,
yeah.
I think the bigger form of malpractice, because people are wrong all the time.
Sure.
Even people who are deeply versed in their field. But the fact is that he doesn't explain that this is outside of his expertise. He will declaim like a prophet on any issue, all the while holding on to his academic appointment, his academic titles, and any other officialdom recognition that he's collected, in theory, from authorities that he shits on all the time, right? Like, who cares if the woke globalists invited you to some climate change panel, right? Why are we listening to them? You're the one who's telling us that they are lobster denying scum.
Right.
And that, to me, it's akin to medical malpractice for a doctor. The reason that I belabor this point is that when I've encountered conservative people that were nonetheless open to dialogue with someone from the left, Jordan Peterson comes up so much. Mm-hmm. He remains one of their intellectual stars, and the conventional kind of lib media accusations, dismissals of Jordan Peterson, that he's sexist, he's racist, he's transphobic, obviously hold no weight. In fact, they do nothing but burnish his authority with that segment. So don't do that. I knew that would be a non-starter if that was the approach that I took. And right, I don't think that it actually gets at the heart of what's wrong with Jordan Peterson. It's a symptom rather than the underlying structural cause. When they heard the case that he was committing intellectual malpractice, I had one person who was a Christian conservative. When I explained to him that Jordan Peterson goes far beyond his realm of expertise, and he declaims with authority on topics which it's fine to have an opinion, but you have to flag it as that. The person I was talking to looked at me, and I could tell that the argument hit, and he's like, oh, he's a false prophet. The conservatives don't like being deceived as much as anyone else. And the thing that I think really makes Jordan Peterson dangerous is his willingness to push with as absolute scientific settled fact the agenda of certain right-wing interests, as well as just a conservative worldview that he's naturalized into evolutionary biological fact.
Yeah. And I mean, this is, the way that he goes on about evolution. I mean, this is something I used to, I think you're right to note that Peterson is still like kind of unfathomably popular in a way that, I think people who are in a left bubble often sort of miss, because like we spent more time thinking about him a few years ago, right? So he seems like yesterday's news, but he continues to be kind of unfathomably popular, like literally more fathomable, like not fathomable if your frame of reference is like, I don't know, you think of somebody who's like really popular as like, Sam Cedar or somebody, or like the, or Slavoj Žižek even, right? That like it's
Yes.
not, it's on a completely different level, and it continues to be so. So I think you are right.
Imagine somebody who has the status, the heft of a figure like Noam Chomsky, but also has access to shadowy networks of billionaire money.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Exactly. So yeah, but that said, I will admit to being in the category that I, spent a lot more time thinking about it a few years ago, kind of right around the time I started doing this stuff. And, but what I did, I remember, thinking about that, a lot, that, he talks about, evolutionary biology all the time in this way that gives you the impression that he has some sort of great expertise in it, right? Like it's completely irrelevant. The actual expertise he has is completely irrelevant to that. He'll often make, basic mistakes. I mean, I remember like his
debate with Zizek, where the only leftist work that Peterson could cite was the Communist Manifesto, and then he did an undergraduate level close reading on stage, turning it into, he reads it with his own lens, and so everything ends up as woke moralism.
Yeah, totally. And yes, I mean, really, most tellingly, had not bothered to read anything by the person he was talking to, but yeah, like even on evolutionary biology, right? Like I remember, this is like stuff I was looking at in 2018, so I don't remember the numbers anymore, but like I remember there's a place where he sort of offhandedly talks, I think in 12 Rules for Life, maybe, about how long ago the closest common ancestor of humans and lobsters was. And, he gets it wrong in like, a way that like multiple zeros at the end of the number wrong, which is like a sort of, small point, and maybe has nothing to do with his larger argument, but is, it is kind of telling about what you're talking about, and I do also want to say on this, but first, yeah, I agree. I think Peterson will very frequently, speak with this tone of great authority about things that he doesn't know anything in particular about, and he's very good at pulling off the impression of great authority. I mean, that's a big source of his popularity. But also I saw in the chat, there was some discussion about, expertise and, and kind of who needs it and for what reason, and I think this is kind of worth spending a second on, because
let me just say one thing before we move on to that, because
yeah,
when you open a point in that way, I know there's going to be some substance. And Jordan Peterson, like you said, a few years ago, he was everywhere. It felt like people were talking about him a lot more. And that's true. However, it's one of those things like the war in Congo or the Gulf of Mexico oil spill. Just because the media attention has moved on from a catastrophe doesn't mean that there's been any resolution, doesn't mean that it's ended.
Right.
And similarly, yes, Jordan Peterson is just like the civil conflict and genocide in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Just because the left and mainstream media have moved on from Jordan Peterson, just because he's had some publicly embarrassing personal setbacks, doesn't change the structural position that he has for many people on the right, many people that are just entering into political awareness, that are kind of right curious or just want to hear what this guy has to say. He's a guru. He remains a significant figure. He hasn't been replaced. Maybe if Ben Shapiro drops a few more diss tracks, but he's still somebody that you're going to have to reckon with if you want to engage outside of left liberal political discourse. I don't have your audio.
Yeah, no question. I mean, I think if you go, I mean, my God, right now, right? Let's just see on Amazon. There's there we go. So 12 Rules for Life, which was published in at the end of 2018, is right now it's number 3,000 or something, 3,000 or so on all of Amazon, which just to like, I know that people who haven't had the experience of neurotically checking the Amazon ranking of a book that they wrote, are might be like kind of less aware of that, but that's, really, really, really good. That, like if you think about the sheer number of books on Amazon, right, that's like in the last, week or whatever, right, that was the 3,000th, most bought book on there. That,
Bible doing.
Yeah, exactly. So, that's huge. Right. So, and yeah, I love the Congo comparison. That's exactly the right way to put it. Like everybody who, if you think of Jordan Peterson as yesterday's news, everybody who you think is a big deal put together has a much smaller reach than Jordan Peterson. That unfortunately is the reality. I just wanted to say on the subject of expertise that, I think we want to make some basic distinctions that, I think that the point that you're making is about like factual assertions, right? So that this is,
and the idea of closing a debate.
Yeah. Like sort of authoritative, decisive, factual assertions. Listen to me. I know what I'm talking about. Here's what's up.
And also the position where, like, I'm not going to show you my math, right? Like, if you're listening to a lecture by Michio Kaku or Neil deGrasse Tyson, and you challenge them on the age of the universe, it's like, well, I could walk you through the equation, the calculation step by step, but you don't know physics and we don't have 3 hours. Jordan Peterson will assert that kind of flex, right? He'll basically tell you that he's are you really going to check his math? And that is something that's not a courtesy that should be extended as part of sitting down with somebody. That's a deference that only is justified through practical exigences and should only be extended to people of demonstrated expertise and integrity.
Yeah, exactly. I think that it is, look, deference to experts on factual issues is a just unavoidable fact of epistemic life. You can't not do it because they're just given any given the existence of complicated bodies of knowledge, not everybody is going to be in a position to check everybody's work, and for much of the time, right? So you have to have some level of intellectual division of labor. Some people look into some things, report back to you. Other people look into other things, report back to you. That's all fine. I think that there was somebody who mentioned something in the chat about something that Chomsky said about required expertise or not. I saw a reference to CLR James, saying every cook can govern. All true, but it's a separate issue. So there's one, we want to sort out factual claims from normative judgments based on them, right? Say so for example, the case of climate change, what's actually happening, right? Versus, how do we feel about trade-offs that, that might come with particular proposals to do something about it, right? And obviously, I want to live in a democratic society where everybody, right, feels entitled to weigh in on that, that second issue. But but I mean, look, to a certain extent, you're just probably not going to have the time, often the ability to double check everybody's work on all of the factual stuff, and it's you just are going to sometimes have to say, okay, well, most of the people who seem to know the most about this conclude X, so I'm going to operate on the basis of thinking that X is probably true. And then if they're going to make further arguments on the basis of that, then you can just see if those arguments make sense to you. I'm all for, everybody. I mean, God knows I'm in the opinion expressing business. I spout off about all kinds of crap, but I also actually try pretty hard sometimes to bracket parts of debates, parts of disagreements that are about factual issues that I feel uncertain about, of which there are actually lots. And it's kind of funny, and I think maybe not a sign of a healthy political culture, that oftentimes people hear that as evasiveness. Oh, you just don't want to say what you think. It's no, I don't know.
Yeah, and this is, like you said, a fundamental problem of epistemology, because you have to balance, on the one hand, an instinct towards skepticism of any major claims about the world. You shouldn't just take it on anybody's authority. Not mine, certainly not Jordan Peterson's. But if you want to know anything about the world in which we inhabit, well, you're not going to derive calculus yourself because you don't trust Newton's math, and it's very limited what an isolated intellect, even a genius, can do without accepting information, right? Without relying on facts from other sources, trusting that other people did the work properly. And in theory and education, right, a academic career was supposed to be this is why I use the term malpractice, that part of the ethic of an intellectual was being judicious in where you're expecting people to listen to you, right? Flagging the places where you're very confident that here I'm giving you good information and you can do with it what you may. This is a solid conclusion that I can retrace the steps, but a lot of people, a lot of my colleagues agree with it. Pretty sure that this is settled fact. Versus, I don't like curvy women on Sports Illustrated swimsuit covers, and blue-haired SJWs are worse than Hitler.
And the interesting factual claim hovering in the background there is that Sports Illustrated, wasn't even, as it was flailing around, since there are not a lot of glossy sports magazines still in business, was not trying to, to address market incentives, but was like engaged in a plot to like, for ideological reasons, to force people to find those.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, exactly. There's, and maybe we'll get to it at some point, but there's a kind of fascinating, he invites this kind of analysis because, as we'll see in the Oxford Union speech, he talks a lot about the frames of meaning that determine action, and that right, like everybody needs to have some value to strive towards, and by their particular worldview, you can try to trace certain certain features of how they imagine the world to work. And for Jordan Peterson, and I think that this partly has to do with the fact that he's a psychologist, this is my opinion, by the way, that he sees the everything as being downstream from culture, that economic, except hierarchy, which is a natural fact of biology, and every other aspect of public life, every other social outcome, is either one group or another group tweaking the frameworks of meaning socially in its own image towards its own favor. And that means that the real power resides in who gets to pick the next Disney princess, who determines what the diversity makeup is of the next teen sitcom, and who decides what's on the cover of Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Okay, I do want to get back to climate change, and maybe to connect some of the dots here. One thing I will say is that because oftentimes you're going to encounter things that you don't have any particular factual expertise in, even when you're listening to people who you suspect of actually knowing more than you about the topic. Never mind Jordan Peterson, who is in his own mind an expert on everything. One thing to pay real close attention to is the inferences, because even if you can't necessarily judge some of the opening factual premises, you can think about how they link together to the conclusion that the person's trying to draw. And in this case, one of the things that's interesting about everything that he just said is that he gave what could just be an argument for people being concerned about climate change, learning to love nuclear, and having a version of a green energy transition that's willing to extensively utilize nuclear. It could be an argument for that, but somehow in his hands, it was an argument for let's just not do anything about climate change.
Yeah, exactly. It's remarkable how often his conclusions, after weighing in and debating, explaining all the reasons why you're wrong, he settles in on a policy program that's the exact preference of powerful conservative interests.
Yes, exactly. All right, let's watch a little bit more of this.
As we are all consuming. It's like, well, maybe, except the data that I've read indicate that if you can get the GDP of people up to about $5,000 a year, then they start caring about the environment, and the environment cleans up. So you could make a perfectly strong case, I think, and a reasonable one, perhaps even a humane one, that the actual idea would be to get everybody in the world who's poor, desperately so, out of poverty as fast as possible, which would increase consumption in the short term, because then they'd start to care about the environment and things would clean up. It's like, okay, well, what are we going to do about global warming? Well, good luck figuring that out. I don't see a solution on the horizon.
Oh, in addition to everything that we've just covered, the pronouncements that he makes are suspiciously similar to the rhetorical strategies coming out of, the Cato Institute or the Heritage Foundation or the American, any activist group on the right? Like he'll crib from the Daily Wire. And this is a classic type of rhetorical move by climate change deniers or people who belong to the climate curious conservatives who are like, the climate is changing, but we can't do anything about it, is to pivot from discussing the types of activities that produce more carbon emissions, the alternative technologies, how to potentially roll them out, and into a kind of gotcha for leftists, right? Like, well, you should actually be for unfettered capitalism and burning more fossil fuels because that'll make people richer and then they care about the environment.
And there's a curious thing at the end of that argument. It's like, because he says, like, the last part of it is, well, then they'll start caring about the environment and it cleans up. It's like, well, hold on. I want to know the mechanism during that last step.
Yes, exactly. Because if you take them seriously, and then it's like, okay, well, what's your plan to reach that goal? The UN has one, which incidentally he shits all over. But he just lays it out as though if you leave the economy as it is, if you let hierarchies do what they're supposed to, then we're just going to get to that 5,000 by burning all the oil. And that displays.
I mean, like there is ultimately, it's like the old, Far Side with the chalkboards full of equations, and then it says here a miracle occurs in the middle. Like there is this big step where people get rich, they care about the environment, they do something, and then it cleans up, right? The environmental problem goes away. And I think it's very telling that he doesn't tell us what the something is, right? It's like, what's okay. So like, once everybody cares about it, then what are they going to do that you would support to head off climate catastrophe, or if he doesn't believe in climate catastrophe, whatever sort of environmental problem he is willing to admit is bad, right? Like what would they then do to head that off? And he doesn't say it, but we should finish this little part of it.
I look at Bjorn Lomborg's work. I really like Bjorn Lomborg. I think he's a real genius. You can look him up if you want. He took the UN millennial goals. There's 200 of them. That's way too many goals if you're serious about goals, by the way, because 200 goals isn't a plan. It's a wish list. You have to prioritize. I'm serious. You have to prioritize but they won't prioritize because each of the goals has its constituents. And if you prioritize, then you irritate the constituents. But if you don't prioritize, then you can't implement the plan. So what Lomborg did was gather a teams of economists, multiple teams, some of whom were Nobel Prize winning economists. He had them assemble teams. He had them rank order development goals in terms of their return on investment, all of the teams. Then he averaged across the teams and came up with a final list. And addressing global warming wasn't even on the list. The most fundamental, he wrote a book called How to Spend $75 Billion to Make the World a Better Place, and that's not very much money on a global scale. Almost everything that he recommended had to do with increased child nutrition in developing countries. It's like, these things are complicated, man. These are complicated. It's like, well, let's fix global warming. It's like, okay, well, good luck with that. First of all, how are you going to do that? And to think that will unite us, but certainly not uniting us so far. So no, and it's the kind of low resolution thinking that just gets us absolutely nowhere. I like what Lomborg did way better. I think it's way more intelligent. So, you know, maybe if you increase child nutrition enough and you produce another, I don't know, 10 million geniuses as a consequence of that, and maybe one of them will figure out what to do about global warming. Well, I'm serious about that, you know? It's not a bad thing to increase the total sum of human brain power, you know? And so we treat these things so lightly. Well, let's fix the planet. Well, we're going to concentrate on global warming. Well, why global warming? Well, because everyone thinks that's the biggest catastrophe. Well, maybe it is, but if you don't have a solution, well, and then what about all those other problems? What are you going to do about them? Well, we'll ignore them because we can feel good about, you know, being concerned about global warming. It's like, you know, one of the reasons there's more trees in the Northern Hemisphere than there were 100 years ago. No one knows that, but it's true, and by a substantial margin. You know why, in part? Because people burned coal instead of wood. It's like everyone says, well, we shouldn't burn coal. It's like, okay, fair enough. What do you want to do? Burn trees instead? Because that's what poor people would have done. It's like, coal isn't good. Well, it's better than burning wood. So these things are complicated. So they're unbelievably complicated. And so, no, it's not going to unite us. And we're not going to do a damn thing about it either. So it doesn't really matter. So, well, what are we going to do? You're going to stop like having heat? You're going to stop having electricity? You're going to stop driving your cars? You're going to stop taking trains? It's like, you're going to stop using your iPhones? You're not going to do any of that. And no wonder. So no.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. Well, that is clearly what people were suggesting. That was obviously the proposal that was on the table, was that everybody stop taking trains and using phones
and burning wood for heat and light. The idea too that he offers this laundry list of modern technological utilities, right? Tools, devices that we take for granted and that it would be very difficult to do without. And in that list, he lists cars and trains, which both fulfill the same transportation role, and one of which is much, much, much lower carbon than the other. So we could just do the trains instead of the cars. That alone would be a major improvement in terms of fossil fuel emissions. So there's a plan to improve the underlying conditions for global warming, reduce CO2 emissions, embedded in his very refutation of the possibility of a plan.
Yeah, I mean, he just, he presents it as if the choices are doing nothing and I don't know, anarcho-primitivism. But obviously there are lots and lots of things that people have actually suggested. For example, building up way more public transportation so people can take the train in situations where they would have driven. Better fuel efficiency standards in cars, for that matter.
The condition that we're in is the result of policy choices. It's not some organic outgrowth of natural human behavior, unless that includes elite collusion and industrial policy. And it's also not objective material reality just emerging from biological fact. But he treats everything that he likes as an immutable reality, and everything he doesn't like as a Bolshevik conspiracy.
Yes. Yeah, he does do that. And yeah, I guess going back, I'll finally maybe to put a bow on this part to what you were talking about at the beginning. Like the biggest thing that struck me about the way he ended that clip is that he clearly thinks that, it's not just that he has a position and he's arguing for it and, he hopes that he's convinced people, but, everything about the presentation screams, this is just discussion ending, right? There's nothing more to be said about this.
Mic drop.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, yeah, but like, what has he said? I mean, there's a lot of gesturing at complexity. There was a pretty obvious leap from saying that Germany wasn't able to denuclearize and get away from coal at the same time to we just shouldn't try to do any sort of energy transition. And then there was this like ludicrous straw man about oh, what are you going to do? Stop taking cars or even trains, which
Yeah. Also, what are we going to do? Stop burning coal and burning wood? And it's like, look, man, you seem to hate every technological adaptation that removes a previous type of technology. But you yourself pointed out that Germany went back to coal only because they got rid of nuclear power. They phased it out after, I believe, the Fukushima disaster. And A, that's something they could undo as an environmental measure. B, there was a time when it's like, oh, what do you mean? Like, are we really going to transition to nuclear? We've got all of this coal here, right? The exact same argument, the exact same tone, the exact same outlook could be applied to block any attempt at technological adaptation. But he's not suggesting that we go Amish. He's just protecting incumbent interests.
Yeah. And I mean, really, like, the whole rhetorical ploy that he's doing here could be used for basically anything that takes a lot of resources and is hard to do. Like, it could be, I mean, it could be that's like, that he's, like, imagine, Jordan Peterson, the day after Pearl Harbor, suggesting surrender in World War II, be like, oh, what are we going to do? Just like rebuild the Navy, from nothing and like reorient the entire economy, around wartime production and, call up massive amounts of people and, oh, are we going to do that? It's like, well, yeah, maybe, right? I mean,
no, what we should obviously do is just let the Japanese develop themselves, because when you get to a certain amount of money, as the statistics will indicate, you become white.
Exactly. Okay. Let's switch. Let's switch from one leafy elite campus to another. So we are now entering Oxford.
Well, that's one of the more positive welcomes I've had from the university community.
All right. Yeah, thank you for coming. If you'd like to give a few opening remarks, and then we'll move on to some questions.
Okay, so I have about half an hour for this, I guess. Eh?
About 15 to 20 minutes for the opening
Okay,
remarks.
okay, that's fine. That's fine, no problem. So I think I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about hierarchy. It's a small talk that I've been developing as I've been doing my public lectures over the last couple of weeks. It's an elaboration of some of the ideas I put forth in some of my scientific writings and in Maps of Meaning, but more particularly in 12 Rules for Life in Rule 1, which is stand up straight with your shoulders back. And it's in part a meditation on hierarchy. And I want to talk about the political significance of that and let you know how I've been trying to sort that out in my own imagination. So I'm going to I think it sheds light on the political, on the nature of political debate itself, and maybe deeper light on why temperamental factors might contribute to political framing and perception, because we know that people tend to vote their temperament, although there are other reasons that influence their political allegiance and their voting behavior. So let's start with a couple of simple observations. The first is that complex biological creatures, and even simple biological creatures for that matter, have to move forward in the world. And so that's the case for any creature that's mobile, and that goes all the way down to one-celled organisms. The idea that approach and avoidance are the fundamental motivations is a very old biological idea and seems to apply across levels of analysis in the animal kingdom. And it's true for us as well. And we have to move forward towards things because we have requirements. There are things that we require to keep us alive and to keep us wanting to be alive as well. And those are different things. And we move forward towards things that we value. So there's two propositions there. The first is that we have to move forward because there are things to move forward to, because there are things we need and want. And the second is that to move forward towards something is simultaneously to value it. And so one of the implications of that is that we always live in a framework of value. There's no escaping that, and that we're moved forward. I detailed this out quite substantially in my book, Maps of Meaning, but we're always at a place, and we're always moving towards a place that in principle has some advantage over the place we're at. Otherwise, why move towards it? And so what that means is that there's no life without value. At least there's no human life without value. Out of necessity, and also not only out of necessity at the physiological level, but also out of necessity at the psychological level, because another thing that you might point out that I think is usefully pointed out is that not only do you have to move from point A to B in life, but point A is often a very difficult place to be because we're fragile and bounded and mortal and limited, and because we know that. And so one of the implications of that, as many great religious traditions are at pains to illustrate or demonstrate or proclaim, is that life is essentially suffering. And I believe that to be a fundamental truth. But perhaps not the most fundamental truth, because I think the most fundamental truth is that despite the fact that life is suffering, people can transcend that. And partly the way they transcend that is by pursuing things of value. And so that if there is no value proposition at hand, then you have no meaning to justify the difficult conditions of your life. And that's brutally difficult for people. You know, Nietzsche said, he who has a why can bear any how. And you see, and I've certainly seen this as a clinical practitioner, that people who have no purpose in their life are embittered by the difficulties of their life. And they become first bitter, and then resentful, and then revengeful, and then cruel. And there's plenty of places to go past cruel. That's just where you start if you're really on a downhill path. All right, so those are the first propositions. The second proposition would be, well, if you're going to pursue something of value, because you're a social creature, you're going to pursue that thing of value in a social space, and that means you're going to compete and cooperate with people around you in the pursuit.
I think maybe let's pause for a minute.
What that inevitably means is that, given that the pursuit of it,
I think that it's tricky to know when to jump in with Peterson, because, or at least larval Peterson, because he'll begin to lecture, and sometimes his lectures can be quite riveting and informative. Like when he talks about psychology, and he's particularly into the big five personality indicators. He'll get to those in the course of the talk. So sometimes you want to hear what he has to say because potentially there's an insight there. Sometimes he will say things that happen to be true or happen to be insightful, or I happen to agree with. When he talks about, he characterizes the one of the fundamental truths of religion as the fact that life is suffering and that there's a tragic element towards existence. I mean, sure. Yeah, that's, what do you do with that though? But he'll also speak for 10 minutes where nothing is defined, and he'll build elaborate castles out of the same vague terminology.
Yeah.
For instance,
this is true, so that's true. And like you have, and like in all that stuff about value just now, right? Like I literally, I'm not sure, right, what he means. Does he mean things that actually objectively are valuable? Does he mean things that like somebody somewhere thinks is valuable? Because when he says things like, oh, we're always moving towards something and it must have value or else we wouldn't be moving there. That's a little slippery.
Exactly. And I think that, and he cribs so much from different sources that if you want to read him charitably, and this is one reason why a lot of defenders of Jordan Peterson say, well, you sent me a clip that you were quibbling with, but if you read all his work, then you'll know exactly what he's talking about, and it's genius. I think that what he means is that human beings, right, have to, there's an exercise of will. You have to do stuff in order to stay alive. And you're only going to do stuff if you care about something or want something. And even if it's just survival. Mm-hmm. And that means that everybody has something that they value and that they operate, they work towards, right? And he gives that Nietzsche quote. Okay, fair enough, right? Like if you have a feeling of purpose in your life, that there's a meaning behind this. And remember, he's a psychologist, so he's been dealing with depressed people all the time who face actually that existential challenge, right? And his solution is, okay, you have to find something that you care about. There has to be some underlying value that drives you. But he begins with the individual example, right? That a person who wants to survive has to have something that they're pushing towards. And now he's pivoting to socializing the issue of values, right? Like that we pursue values in a social way. And what he'll do is he'll conflate the individual identification of some kind of value for their own life, some kind of direction, a project or purpose or meaning that can shape their actions with, value in society as some characteristics that we collectively pursue and determine. And that's a huge leap that is not based in, I see no connective tissue between those two observations. But without that, then all you have to do is take his word on this next bit.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And when he does, when he relates it to religion, and he gives the Buddha's, first couple of noble truths, as, and he presents these as like sort of basic assertions of religion in general, which actually that part I'm kind of fine with. I think that's plausible as far as it goes. But he is vaguely connecting it to all of this value talk, and I think you need to be really careful whenever Peterson starts talking about religion, because look, you were at the live show in LA where we played the Who Said It, Peterson or Derrida game, and that the last one, right, the one that everybody knew because it'd been going around, was the one where somebody asks him if he believes in God, and he says, oh, I don't know, what does believe mean? What does do you mean? And this is kind of typical of the games that he plays with this. And I think very often, right, that's like he's sort of most comfortable with this vague talk about value and stuff like that. And he sort of wants to relate it all somehow to the God stuff. But I think the problem is that he really doesn't like believe in, what at the very least the great majority of people who would consider themselves to be believing, Christians or Muslims or Jews would consider to be believing in God, right? Like he really doesn't, right? I mean, I think it's he's
actually what you get when you go boomer male academic and max out spiritual but not religious.
Yeah, exactly, right? Like that's exactly it. He's a maxed out spiritual but not religious guy. And sort of for culture war reasons, he likes to sort of present that as in this way where he's like condemning non-belief, but what he really means is condemning like non-spirituality, right? That's that you need to you need to have some you need to have at least his level of maxed out spiritual but not religiousness. But yeah, there's nothing that like your Christian conservative friend that you were talking about earlier would recognize as actual religious belief going on there once you look under the hood.
If anything valuable is going to be a collective enterprise, that you're going to produce a hierarchy, or maybe more than one hierarchy, but at least a hierarchy of competence in relationship to that pursuit. So it doesn't matter what you decide to pursue. Maybe you're going to do that cooperatively. You're going to find that you and other people vary in your ability to manage that pursuit effectively and efficiently. And so there's going to be a hierarchy of people, from those who are very good at the pursuit. Maybe it's pole vaulting, maybe it's delivering massages, maybe it's delivering groceries, maybe it's setting up an enterprise. It doesn't matter. But if it's a valuable pursuit and you pursue it socially, you're going to produce a hierarchy. And the hierarchy is going to be one of competence. And so if you're going to pursue value, then you're going to construct a hierarchy. And then there's an implication from that, which is that if you construct a hierarchy, most of the people within that hierarchical structure are a minority of people are going to be fantastically successful at the pursuit, and a very large number are going to stack up at the bottom. And that's a manifestation.
Not true.
What's known as Price's law.
And this is one of those cases where I think he's committing that intellectual malpractice that I talked about. The putting aside the talk about hierarchy and hierarchies of excellence, hierarchies of competence, whatever, the idea that if you have a particular activity, there's going to be a incredible amount of benefit going to the top people according to a Pareto distribution. It's an economic principle that applies to a very, very narrow set of circumstances. It does apply to some set of circumstances, right? Like if you look at things like book publishing or music, the number of it's going to be something like 20-80, right? 20% of authors account for 80% of books. It's probably skewed even more than that. But that's because of the printing press, mass production, certain network effects around fan communities, the availability of large-scale distribution. If the thing that you value is, excellence in medicine, for instance, well, a whole bunch of doctors can treat certain conditions and save people's lives. They're all winners. You don't necessarily have that winner-takes-all model in all aspects of life, in any value that you give. He presents this as though it were that kind of immutable natural fact, that this was a law of physics. And it is simply not true, right? If he wants to debate the point and make an argument that this distribution applies universally, I would welcome that. I would entertain that. I would need to see his math, right? And but that's not what he's doing. He's telling you that, right, the sky is blue, plants are green, and space is cold, and also inequality is intrinsically linked to the biological aspects, even the ontological aspects of human social life. So, bad Peterson. Bad Peterson.
Yeah, I also, to the very last part of what you just said before bad Peterson, on inequality, I did just want to flag here, like, as he starts talking about hierarchy, like, pay attention to the ways that he's going to be using that word, right? I mean, much like the point you just made about value, right? There's, you can have, like, hierarchy, especially in the way that Peterson uses the word, oftentimes just sort of means anything whatsoever being unequally distributed. And so, it could be talent, it could be power, it could be resources. And it's, but like clearly, he wants to, like, one of the things, right? I mean, there's oftentimes a massive equivocation going on here, because he says that, he accuses his political enemies of wanting to get rid of hierarchy. And that's true if, or whatever, so partially true in a complicated way, if hierarchy has to do with unequal distribution of resources, maybe, certainly of power, but it's not at all true if hierarchy is being used in this broader way. I mean, that there's nobody, like, even people who are, in certain respects, much more radical than I am, right? That they don't just want to socialize the means of production. They want, they want a anarchist society that, lacks certain forms of hierarchy, I think are probably, not reasonably eliminable or whatever. Like, even those people don't want, like, they're not out there advocating for Harrison Bergeron, right? They're fine with some people being better at doing some tasks than other people, right? If that's what hierarchy means, right? The ineliminability of hierarchy is way more plausible if you're using it in the broadest sense. But if you're using it in the broadest sense, it's irrelevant to the political context that he often wants to bring it up in. And, the very narrow sense of hierarchy that's actually relevant to political contexts, even if he was right, that you're going to get, Pareto distributions and on sort of all realms of, of competence or productivity or whatever, right? Would still be a somewhat separate issue, because, people could be unequally good at things, and what that means about what you should do about how you arrange society is just going to be a separate issue. And I would point out also on this that historically, most hierarchies in the usual political sense have had very little to do with competence, right? Like that's kind of
Often it just birth.
yeah.
Well,
Right.
well, yeah, the first generation, there's going to be competence, right?
Yeah.
Like
Well, if they're not going to be able to
um,
use those resources,
the castle won't storm itself, right? But after that, and I think that if you, because he's also implying conclusion that sometimes he gets to explicitly, which is because there is an inequality of competence arranged hierarchically, the people who are at the top of the hierarchy deserve a lot more money.
right.
And how do you know that they're at the top of the hierarchy? Because they've got all the money. And I think that his refusal to go beyond actually define terms, produce some concrete examples, maybe deliver some empirics, that ties into the fact that he doesn't actually want to address any downstream arguments. He feels like the entire debate takes place in some moral, cultural, philosophical arena. And as long as your fundamental arguments have enough gotchas for your enemies, then that means you're right, and society should be shaped as you desire.
You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.